The turning of the seasons in medieval Europe was not marked by a date on a calendar, but by the smell of the air, the feel of the soil, and the sounds of the village preparing for what lay ahead. Autumn, with its brief golden glow, was a time of harvest, of gathering in every last ear of grain, every last root pulled from the dark earth, every bit of wood chopped and stacked before the frosts came. For peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, winter was not a romantic season of snowflakes and stillness. It was a looming presence, a slow test of survival. And every year, when the first hard frost painted the fields silver, families asked themselves the same silent question. Had they done enough to endure what was coming? For most, survival began with food. The harvest was not a feast, but a frantic attempt to store away the essentials of life. After long days of reaping, threshing, and winnowing, sacks of grain were carefully sealed against dampness and rodents. Barley, oats, and rye were the staples, and every kernel mattered. Grains were often stored in simple bins, sometimes lined with clay or waxed cloth, sometimes hidden in pits dug into the ground, anything to keep them safe from the gnawing of mice or the slow rot of moisture. Families knew that whatever they failed to protect in November would haunt them in February. Vegetables were a second lifeline. Turnips, onions, cabbages, and carrots, humble, hardy foods, were buried deep in cellars or covered in straw and packed into storage pits. The air in these dark corners was cold and damp, but that was precisely what kept the vegetables from shriveling. Cabbages might be salted or fermented into something resembling sauerkraut, a sour but nutritious dish that could keep a belly from aching with hunger. Beans and peas were dried in the last weak sun of autumn, their pods crackling open, then stored away in jars or sacks. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. Meat, when it appeared, was an event. Most peasants did not eat meat daily, not even weekly. Livestock were precious. Chickens laid eggs, goats gave milk, pigs and cows were wealth on four legs. But winter was harsh, and feeding animals through months of snow was nearly impossible. So, late autumn became the season of slaughter. Families and villages gathered to kill pigs, preserving the meat in as many ways as possible. Hams were salted, sausages stuffed with spice scraps, and cuts of pork smoked over low fires until they were blackened and tough. This was not feasting, it was banking calories against the long, dark months. The taste of smoked meat, hanging from the rafters, was a comfort on nights when the wind shrieked against the walls. Still, by midwinter, hunger was inevitable. Fresh bread became rare. Loaves were often made with coarse rye or even mixed with ground-up peas or acorns to stretch the flour further. The bread was heavy, dark, and sometimes bitter, but it kept people alive. Gruel, a thin porridge made from oats or barley boiled in water, was the daily fare, eaten morning and night, sometimes flavored with a scrap of onion or a pinch of dried herbs if a household was lucky. On the hungriest days, families gnawed on hardened crusts dipped into broth so thin it was nearly water. Peasant children grew used to stomachs that rumbled in the quiet of night. And yet they endured because they had to. Food was only part of the struggle. The cold itself was a merciless opponent. Medieval houses were small, built from wattle and daub, woven wooden frames smeared with clay and mud, or rough stone. The roofs were thatched with straw. Inside, there was usually a single room, sometimes two, with a hearth at the center. The fire was life, and families did everything possible to keep it burning. Chimneys were rare, so smoke drifted and clung inside the house, stinging eyes and lungs, coating the rafters black. Still, the alternative was worse. To let the fire die was unthinkable, because restarting it meant begging a neighbor for a burning log or struggling with flint and tinder in the freezing dark. Warmth was found in numbers. Whole families, parents, children, and often grandparents, slept side by side on straw pallets covered with woolen blankets. Animals too were brought inside. A cow or a pig kept in one corner gave off a surprising amount of heat, and chickens roosting overhead added their own warmth to the air. It was crowded, it was smoky, it was damp, but it was survivable. On nights when the snow piled high against the door and the wind howled like a beast outside, survival was all anyone could ask for. Work too did not cease with the snow. Men repaired tools by the dim glow of the hearth, sharpening scythes or fixing ploughs. They carved wooden bowls, mended fences, and prepared for the next season, even as this one pressed down on them. Women spun wool, mended torn garments, and kept careful watch over food supplies, rationing each portion so that the family would not starve before spring returned. Children carried wood, fetched water, or helped twist reeds into ropes. Life slowed, but it never stopped. And through it all, the church marked the passage of time. The rhythm of prayer and feast days gave peasants a kind of structure in the endless dark. Christmas was a rare moment of joy, when neighbours might gather and share what little they had, even if it was only a mug of ale or a song sung by firelight. Candlemas in early February promised that the worst might soon be over, though snow often lingered. These were not celebrations of abundance, but of hope, the kind of hope that keeps people going when everything around them is cold and bare. Medieval peasants lived each winter as if stepping onto a narrow bridge over a deep ravine, careful with every step, knowing that one miscalculation, too little food stored, too much illness, too severe a frost, could send them tumbling into tragedy. Yet somehow, year after year, villages survived. Not all, not always. But enough endured that life continued, season after season, carried on by sheer resilience. The cold months were never just about hunger and freezing air. They were also about illness, the quiet threat that crept into homes and often lingered long after the fire was out. Winter in medieval Europe was the season of sickness. Coughs rattled through smoky huts, fevers rose with no medicine to cure them, and small injuries that would be trivial in summer could turn deadly when bodies were weak from hunger and damp air seeped into bones. The idea of health was not what we know today. Peasants spoke of bad humours, of imbalances caused by food, weather, or even the phases of the moon. Still, whatever their understanding, they recognized the danger. A small infection, a lingering cough, a child's fever, any of these could mean tragedy in a time when every family was already on the edge. The smoke inside their huts didn't help. Chimneys were uncommon, and so the hearthfire filled the air with a constant haze. Eyes burned, lungs struggled, and children often grew up with wheezing breaths. The damp floors, sometimes nothing more than packed earth, were cold to the touch, and even the strongest farmer felt the ache of joints stiffened by the chill. When people became sick, there was little that could be done. A village might have a wise woman who brewed teas from dried herbs, thyme to soothe coughs, garlic for strength, willow bark for pain. Sometimes these helped, sometimes they did not. Prayer was as common a cure as any drink or potion, and the parish priest's blessing was often the only medicine people could afford. Illness also spread because winter meant closeness. Entire families and even animals pressed together in one room for warmth, sharing air, blankets, and sometimes sickness. If one child caught a fever, there was little chance of containing it. Disease did not respect the boundaries of wealth either. Nobles had larger homes, more food, and better clothing. Yet even in castles, the winter chill crept into stone halls, and epidemics travelled from village to manor without discrimination. In those months, rich and poor alike learned the same lesson. Nature's power could not be ignored. But even in hardship, winter had its rhythms of community. Villagers depended on each other because isolation was nearly impossible. Neighbours might trade food, barley for beans, salt for eggs, or lend a hand splitting firewood. Shared survival bound the village together in quiet ways. Stories and songs passed the long nights. Around the hearth, elders told tales of saints, of kings, of distant lands most peasants would never see. Children dozed off listening to these voices, the stories blurring with the crackle of firewood. These moments, though small, gave life a texture beyond hunger and cold. They reminded people that even in scarcity, they had one another. The church, ever present, was both a comfort and a weight. It reminded peasants that suffering was not meaningless, but part of God's plan. To endure the cold and hunger patiently was, in their eyes, to share in the hardships of Christ. Some priests preached that famine and sickness were punishments for sin, while others encouraged villagers to see endurance as a test of faith. Either way, religion offered a lens through which peasants could interpret their struggle. The candles lit on feast days, the Latin chants echoing in wooden chapels, gave a sense of order amid the chaos of survival. Meanwhile, the landscape itself shaped their lives. Winter fields were barren, brown earth hidden under blankets of snow or frozen solid. Paths between villages grew treacherous, and rivers swelled with ice. Travel slowed to a crawl. For most peasants, winter meant confinement. Their world shrank to the few miles around their huts and fields. The horizon was a pale blur of grey sky and white earth, and time stretched long and heavy. Days blended together, marked only by the rhythm of chores, feeding animals, tending fires, boiling gruel. It was a season not of adventure, but of waiting, of passing from one day to the next in hopes of reaching spring. Yet there was beauty too, even in such a harsh season. Frost glittered on the bare branches. The air carried a sharp stillness that made the sound of church bells travel further across the valley. A snowfall could blanket the village in silence, muffling the creak of doors, the shuffle of feet, the barking of dogs. In these moments, peasants found a kind of peace, brief but real, in the quiet of the world asleep under snow. They knew it would not last. The thaw would bring mud, sickness, and hunger renewed, but for a while there was calm. Winter demanded patience, endurance, and above all, humility. No matter how carefully peasants prepared, no matter how many jars they filled or logs they stacked, the outcome was never certain. A storm could wipe out food stores. A sickness could weaken an entire family. Hunger could take even the strongest men by late February. And still, people endured year after year, generation after generation. Their resilience was not heroic in the way of knights and kings. It was quiet, ordinary, almost invisible. But it was resilience all the same, the kind that kept villages alive through centuries of brutal winters. As the heart of winter settled in, days became a slow blur, stretching endlessly in the dim light of short afternoons and long, unyielding nights. For peasants, time itself felt different in these months. Summer was full of movement, fields alive with the swing of scythes, the laughter of neighbors working side by side, the steady rhythm of planting, harvesting, and gathering. Winter was something else entirely. The earth no longer gave, and the world seemed paused, suspended in frost and silence. It was in this strange stillness that peasants learned to fill their days with tasks that were small, but vital, to carry them through. Inside the smoky warmth of their huts, families turned to work that summer never allowed. Men might spend hours carving wood, shaping handles for tools or simple bowls and spoons for the household. These items, though plain, were made with care, often passed down from father to son. Women spun wool into thread, their fingers moving steadily, even in the dim light of the hearth. They patched worn clothes again and again, turning rags into garments that could survive one more season. Nothing was wasted. A scrap of cloth became a patch, a broken pot was repaired with metal staples, and leather was softened, restitched, and reused until it could no longer hold together. Children had their part as well. They were sent to gather sticks and twigs for kindling, to help fetch water from streams that sometimes had to be broken open with stones to reach beneath the ice. They twisted ropes from reeds, fed chickens, and learned by imitation, copying their parents' work, practicing skills that would one day mean survival for their own families. Even play, when it happened, often mirrored adult labor, shaping little figures from clay, pretending to tend animals, or drawing patterns with sticks in the snow. Despite the isolation, winter was also a season of community. Villagers often relied on each other more than in any other time of year. When food ran low, families might share a little of what they had, knowing the favor would be returned in another season. A neighbor might help repair a roof damaged by storms, or lend a burning log if another household's fire went out. In such moments, survival became collective, not individual. The strength of a village lay in these small acts of solidarity, built on bonds of trust and necessity. Evenings carried their own rituals. As the fire glowed low and the cold pressed against the walls, families drew close together. Elders told stories, myths of old heroes, tales of saints who endured suffering, or half-remembered legends of ancient kings. These stories did more than pass the time. They connected the present struggle to something larger, something that gave meaning to endurance. Songs, too, were sung, simple chants, folk tunes carried down generations, often with rhythms easy enough for children to join. The sound of voices filled the hut, masking for a time the howling of the wind outside. The mind itself faced challenges in these endless winters. Darkness weighed heavily on people. Without steady sunlight, days blended, and weariness settled deep. Many peasants experienced what we might now call despair, feelings of hopelessness as hunger gnawed and illness lingered. But their culture offered tools against this despair. Religion was one. Faith, for all its strictness, gave purpose to suffering, presenting endurance as a spiritual test. Another was the cycle of feasts and fasts, which broke monotony and gave people something to anticipate. Even a small celebration, bread dipped in honey at Christmas, or the lighting of candles at Candlemas, brought a flicker of joy that reminded them spring would return. Nature itself was a teacher. In winter, peasants learned patience, humility, and respect for forces far greater than themselves. The snow blanketing the fields, the icy rivers, the bare branches etched against the sky, all were reminders of their dependence on the earth. They understood, in ways that modern people often forget, that survival was never guaranteed, that each day of life was earned through struggle and endurance. And yet, there was a quiet beauty in these winters. The silence of a snowy field at dawn, the sparkle of frost on a thatched roof, the warmth of a family huddled together against the cold. These moments stitched meaning into hardship. They did not erase the hunger or the sickness, but they made life bearable, even profound. For medieval peasants, winter was not simply an enemy to outlast, but a season that shaped who they were. Resilient, communal, deeply tied to the land and to one another. As the final stretch of winter dragged on, the days seemed longer, heavier, and crueler. This was the season people feared most, what some called the hungry gap. By February and March, the food that had been carefully stored in autumn was nearly gone. Bins of grain sat low, vegetable pits were empty or filled only with rotting scraps, and the last smoked meats hung hard and dry, almost inedible without boiling. Families cut portions smaller and smaller, sometimes breaking bread so thin that each slice was hardly more than a mouthful. Hunger was not rare, it was expected. Stomachs ached constantly, and the weaker members of the household, especially children and the elderly, often did not survive to see the thaw. Yet even in this bleak time, there were signs of hope. The days began to stretch, light lingering longer in the evenings. The frozen ground softened just enough to suggest that spring was not far away. Villagers kept careful watch for these changes. The first shoots of green pushing up through the snow, the first lambs born in the fields. These were not just signs of nature, but symbols of survival. To endure winter was to earn the right to begin again. Work shifted toward preparation for the coming season. Men inspected plows, sharpening blades and repairing wooden frames. Oxen, thin but alive, were readied for the hard labor to come. Women sorted seeds carefully, saving what had been stored from the last harvest, knowing that each handful scattered into the earth meant the possibility of food for the entire year. Children were sent out to gather kindling and clear fields of stones, small hands preparing land that would one day be theirs to till. Life began to stir again, cautiously, quietly. Still, survival was never guaranteed until the first harvest of spring. Early crops like peas and beans were precious, and the hunger of March and April often pressed hardest of all. This was the cruel irony of medieval life. Just as the snow melted and the land awoke, bellies were emptiest. Some peasants foraged for edible greens, nettles, and wild herbs, boiling them into thin soups that tasted bitter but kept life going. These were meals of desperation, yet they were also the first taste of something fresh after months of dried and salted food. Relief came slowly, almost imperceptibly. One day, the river ran free of ice. Another day, the trees budded with green. Birds returned, filling the air with sound after the long, quiet months. And finally, when the fields began to yield, the tension of winter lifted. The peasants who survived found themselves breathing easier, moving with new energy, and daring to imagine a year of abundance. But they did not forget. The memory of cold nights, smoky huts, and the ache of hunger lingered, shaping how they lived and prepared for the future. Every summer's work was haunted by the knowledge that winter would come again. This cycle repeated endlessly, generation after generation. Winter tested the body, the spirit, and the will of every peasant. It stripped life down to its most basic elements: fire, food, shelter, and family, and in doing so, revealed the raw resilience of ordinary people. They were not warriors or kings, yet their endurance was no less remarkable. Through hardship, through hunger, through cold and sickness, they held on. With spring's return, peasants felt quiet triumph. The fields would feed them, the sun would warm them, and though winter would come again, they knew they would endure.